Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today we are waking up for the semester with our NCMC webinar series. So thank you very much for showing up. I hope you were present to some of our webinars in the last semester, and this is the first one of the second semester of the year. Today, we're going to have the pleasure of having Dr. Joshua Weiss. Before I do a quick introduction of him, let me just go through our house rules. So the audience is muted and the video is off, so we can all focus on the speaker of today. The chat box is only for the host posting. So YE will eventually be posting links to articles, books, resources, and others that are relevant from the NCMC, and particularly the book and the website from Dr. Joshua Weiss. The Q&A tab, though, is for you to ask your questions. You can start asking them as soon as you have them. And please, even if you don't have any questions, do check the Q&A so you can upvote the questions that you like the most. So because I will then give priority to the ones that have the most number of votes. Dr. Joshua Weiss was actually very kind. He said any question goes. He will try to focus extremely on the negotiation angle, avoiding the politics, but any questions of negotiation and conflicts around the world are game for today. Useful information and links will be shared again, as I said, at the end of the webinar, and then recording will also be made available at a later date. So you can go to the NCMC website outreach tab, and you will see the webinars from the previous ones and this one as well in a couple of weeks. With that, then, let me just move on straight to our main event, our speaker. So Dr. Joshua Weiss, co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative, which advises and supports international, mostly negotiations around the world. So he puts his hands dirty, he gets the real thing done. A book is called Getting Back to the Table, Learning from Your Setbacks and Failures to Become a Better Negotiator, which is also the title of today's session. Without further ado, let me pass it on to our guest speaker of today, Dr. Joshua Weiss. Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Weiss.
Thank you, Horatio. Really appreciate the invitation. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. Let me go ahead and just put up some slides here that you can see, and I'll use to kind of go through. Let me just put up, make sure I have the right one there. All right, can everybody see that okay? Yep. Okay. Great. All right. So thank you, everyone. And again, it's a pleasure to be with you. So I am going to spend about a half an hour, maybe a little longer, on talking about this book, why I wrote it, what I was trying to accomplish, and then to share sort of the framework that is laid out in the book. Um, for me, frameworks are a useful way of trying to learn something new. Eventually, the idea is that frameworks become less important and become the backbone of what you're doing and how you're learning from something, and that you internalize the framework and think about what to do with it. So I wrote this book that came out in February called Getting Back to the Table, 5 Steps to Reviving Stalled Negotiations. And it's really in many ways about failure and negotiation. But setbacks, of course, make their way into the conversation as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Um, Let me tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book. So in 2020, I wrote another book called The Book of Real World Negotiations, which was 25 cases of actual negotiations from around the world. And the reason for doing that is when I first started working at Harvard, I would go to these faculty dinners, and um, there were about 25 people that would go there, and people would share these fascinating examples and stories that they had been working on that the rest of the world didn't know. And I thought, this is really interesting. But there's a problem, which is there's only 25 of us who know about this story now, and we need to be pushing this out into the world so people understand the usefulness and the power of negotiation and conflict resolution to deal with problems and challenges. And a person came up to me a couple of years ago and said to me, I was at a conference, and she said, I really loved your book. The real world examples are incredibly useful. I'm a trainer and things like that. But I just have one question. Why did you focus on the successes? And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, because I learn so much more from my failures. And I thought, okay. And she said, would you ever consider writing a book about failure and negotiation? And I said, I don't know. Let me think about it. So I began to think about it, and I began to look around and to look at what is it that we as a field have to say about this? Like, how do we help people when things don't go well? And one of the things that I quickly discovered was there was very little written about this. There were a few chapters and some articles, but that was about it. And I thought, gee, um, I might dive into this. And then I was talking to one of my students, um, and she had said to me, what are you working on now? And I explained the idea, and her reply was the second quote there that you see, which was, thank goodness. I feel like all we read about is successes. It feels like if we don't succeed all the time, we're bad negotiators. And I thought, if that's the perception that you have, we, as those of us who are teaching you and helping you to learn this stuff, are failing you. We are not presenting a realistic picture of negotiation. And anybody that negotiates knows that setbacks and failures are part of the landscape of negotiation. And yet, for some reason, we're not talking about it. And I thought I need to dive into this because I can clearly hear from different people that this is important and they don't have any input or insight on how to try to deal with this as part of their negotiation journey, if I can put it that way, right? And so part of the purpose of the book was to recognize that setbacks and failures are part of the negotiation landscape and to normalize that and say, look, when you fail or if you experience a significant setback, it's okay. The world's not going to end. And how do you figure out, can I get back to the table if I believe that's important and I can still see an avenue to do that? Or if I really can't, how do I learn from this to become a better negotiator? And to go back to the first woman, who mentioned this, we really do learn much more from our failures than our successes because we keep playing that story over in our minds over and over again. And so ultimately, the goal of the book is twofold. One is to say, this is going to happen. You need to deal with it when it does, and to help people to really learn from these setbacks and failures. And that led me to, well, what are the typical responses that people have when they experience a significant setback or an important or an outright failure where the negotiation collapses and there's no way back to the table? Both happen, right? So to explain this to people, I went to the fairy tale Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And I'm fairly sure that most people have heard this, but in one sense, if they have not, let me just share the brief story so that I don't assume anything. But basically, Goldilocks is wandering the woods. She gets lost and finds a house, goes in the house, and there are three bowls of porridge. And one of the bowls is too hot, one is too cold, and one is just right. Right? And there's more to the story, but you don't really need to know the rest of the story. What you need to know is that there's a too hot, a too cold, and a just right approach to learning from your failures and setbacks. So the too hot approach would be what I would call blame and rationalization. So when people fail, one of the typical responses that I found as I did my research and talked to people and did surveys and whatever was the too hot approach, that people when they think about that negotiation that didn't go well, they blame the other, they blame the circumstances, and they rationalize their behavior. They say, if I wasn't boxed into a corner, I wouldn't have made this decision, something like that, right? So, and the problem is that we don't learn much when we're blaming the other or we're rationalizing our behavior. Okay. So that approach isn't very helpful. The too cold approach is really about anxiety, that when you fail, it becomes debilitating. It becomes something that for many people, they never want to negotiate again. Or if they do negotiate again, they do so feeling very uncomfortable about the whole process. They experience this kind of anxiety. And again, very hard to learn when you're feeling anxious. And that's the overarching kind of way that you're viewing things. The just right approach is to learn from it, is to say, okay, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I was hoping for, etc. But I am where I am. Like this didn't work out in the way that I sort of had hoped. So what do I do about it now? Can I get back to the table? And if I can't, what did I learn from this experience? One of the things that I've found as I do trainings with a lot of governments and companies and others, because I also have a consulting company, is that people will say that, that negotiation was a great experience. Like I learned a lot. And when I push them a bit and say, what did you really learn? I find that they didn't actually really learn a lot. They just picked up that phrase that experience is a great teacher and somehow thought that they would just take in everything, but they don't. You really have to examine what transpired to genuinely learn from something. Okay. So those are the typical responses. Now, what I did in the book was I wanted to try to make this helpful for people. So what I tried to do was lay out the different types of failure that you can experience in negotiation. Because again, this was not something that we talked about. So there are 7 types of failure that I lay out in the book. Now, I'm not claiming these are all of the types of failures. These were just the ones that I have experienced and could think about, etc. And I'm just going to share with you 3 of them so you get an idea of what this looks like. And the point of doing this was to say to people, look, here are the ways that you can fail in negotiation. So be on the lookout for these. Don't fall into the trap um, of experiencing these things and realizing it afterwards. Okay. And by the way, you notice on the title of the slide, I say examples of failure and their magnitude. So when people fail, they want to know why and they want to know how bad is it, right? So I created a 4 sort of level scale of magnitude of how bad is the failure from not so bad. And I can pretty much see a track right back to the table with a little creativity to number 4 being a complete disaster. The negotiation's not going to happen for the foreseeable future, and we're talking about a failure. Okay. So it's important to think on these 2 dimensions. So the first type of failure that I talk about is called slipping through your fingers failure. And this is the kind of failure where if you were to step back and look at a situation or a negotiation, the negotiation uh, looks like an agreement should be possible based on the parties' interests and things like that. And yet somehow something gets in the way, whether it's disrespect or something along those lines. And so a deal that looks eminently doable slips through their fingers and doesn't get done. Okay. The second type that I'll just mention here again is the what were you thinking failure. So the what were you thinking failure is when you agree to something that doesn't meet your objectives. And this often happens because people think that the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement, and it's not. The purpose of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible. When people think that the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement, they often will do so without actually achieving their objective. They'll think that I'm supposed to reach an agreement here, so I can't walk away, even though this agreement doesn't quite meet my goals, right? Not advisable to me. That's a failure, right? Um, and then the third kind that I'll just mention here is something called penny wise and pound foolish. So the penny wise and pound foolish type of failure is where we, in the short term, seek to gain more, but in the long term, we damage a relationship that we really need and that we're going to have going forward. So the notion of penny wise and pound foolish is that we take an extra penny now at the expense of a pound of something later, a much greater gain later. And to me, this often happens when we don't understand the importance of the relationship in negotiation. So, when I do trainings or whatever it is in teaching for companies and governments, and I ask people, how many of your negotiations are one-off versus, you're going to negotiate with the same people or organizations over and over again. Usually it's about 10% of their negotiations are one-time negotiations and 90% are with the same people. And I say, well, then if you're not respecting the relationship and building the relationship as you negotiate, then you're engaging in a penny wise and pound foolish approach to negotiation. Okay, so that just gives you a flavor. Like I said, there are others in the book that you can also look to understand so that you don't fall into these traps. Now, I just want to mention one other quick thing before I get into the framework, the 5 steps that I sort of propose for really learning about this. And it's really about why don't we learn from our failures? This was a theme that I really saw from people was that even though they think they learn from their failures, they really don't. And so The first reason is really, again, back to blame and rationalization. I won't say more about that, but again, when people are stuck in blame, you don't learn. You simply don't. And so we have to be aware of that trap and push that aside if we're generally going to learn from what happened. The two others, though, that I think are important to keep in mind is that there are a tremendous amount of biases. So I'm a really very big fan of the role of the psychological in negotiation and dealing with conflict. It plays a huge role in all of this, as I'm sure you all know. What goes along with that are a number of biases that we are susceptible to as human beings that we don't pay attention to, that we are unaware of unless they are made aware to us that these things exist. And when we know that these biases are there, we can manage them effectively. But a big reason why we don't learn from our failures is because we have some biases. So one is a self-serving bias. A self-serving bias is where we essentially look at what we do in a positive light. Um, that I had to take this action, etc. But we look at what the other party does in a negative light. Okay. The backfire effect is another bias where when our views or perspectives are challenged, instead of examining those views, what we do is we double down on them, if I can put it that way. We dig in even more and advocate for those views. And again, very hard to learn when you're not taking in and saying, well, maybe there's something to this critique or the criticism that I'm getting, right? And then human beings are also loss averse. And what that means is that we're always sort of seeking to protect ourselves and our perspective on things. And when we're loss averse, it's very hard to learn because we're always thinking about defensive measures and ways of protecting ourselves. And this goes back to our instinctual time, maybe when we were hunter-gatherers, right? If we lost back in those days, we got eaten, right? And that's not a very favorable prospect. Today, the consequences often are not as significant, but that notion of loss aversion and trying to avoid that is something that we continue to hold on to, and it gets in our way. And then the third reason why we don't learn from our failures is because we develop what are called heuristics or mental shortcuts. And those mental shortcuts can be really helpful in making sense of life, but they can also get in the way. Um, if I have a certain approach to negotiation that I've learned works well, I have a tendency to use that approach in most negotiations and not really analyze what's going on and can I really transfer these lessons or not. Okay. So those are the reasons that we don't learn. So as I was thinking about this, I thought, let me try to lay out a process for people to really try to understand what's happened in their negotiations. Okay. So I'm going to just take you through this. Obviously, this is laid out in much more detail in the book, but I want to give you a flavor of what this looks like so you can think about it and think about perhaps what you already do and then maybe what are some things that you can add to the mix that you don't do right now when things don't go as planned. So the first step is something called you failed, accept it. And this is an important step for us because um, whether we like it or not, when it comes to negotiation and setbacks and failures, we experience some form of grief, if I can put it that way. Okay. Now, sometimes people say that sounds a little dramatic, but the reality is that that's what it feels like to us. When we don't meet our objectives, we experience an element of grief, an element of not getting what we wanted, right? Now, there's a curve of what's called the curve of acceptance that was developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a social psychologist, to help people to understand how they cope with terminal illness. Okay. So this was developed a number of years ago. She said when people are told this, this is the process they go through for trying to deal with it and cope with it. Right. And this curve has been used in a lot of different ways. And for me, it's a very useful tool for saying when you don't get where you want to go, you begin to experience these different steps and you begin to feel them. And if you don't allow yourself to feel this, it's a little bit like a backed up sink, right? Like when sinks get backed up, nothing gets through. And a lot of times people want to just jump into the logical and the rational, and they don't want to feel the sting of not getting where they want to go. And that's what this is all about. This first step is really taking it in and saying, okay, um, this didn't go well. Like, where am I on this curve? Like, how am I dealing with this? Right. And so I've modified this a little bit from Kubler-Ross's original curve to reflect, um, I think, some of the steps that people go through. Now, the one thing I just want to say very briefly about this model has been critiqued because the way that she originally presented it was that everybody goes through these steps. And I don't think that's true. I think people go through many of these, but I've definitely met people who will go begin with denial and go into anxiety, but they don't go into anger. They skip over anger into sadness and then acceptance and problem solving. So there's an individual element to this, but what I'm really trying to get at is don't ignore the emotional aspects of what's going on. You have to cope with this. You have to say, this is really disappointing. I'm going to sit with the disappointment and then I'm going to make my way through this process of coping with it. And the first step is typically denial, right? That this can't be happening. Like I need this negotiation to work. And if it's not working, then that's what you begin feeling. I added in anxiety. Anxiety was not part of the original model, but what I typically see is that people experience some form of anxiety because they're now in an uncertain period and time of, I don't know what's going to happen. And that makes me very uncomfortable. Some people progress to anger, right? I'm really angry, upset about this. It's all their fault or whatever. Then sadness, I'm disappointed because I'm not getting what I want, ultimately to acceptance and problem solving. The idea is sit with this. Don't push it aside. Don't say emotions play no role in negotiation because that's not true. Take it in and say, this is really disappointing. And I have to process this so that I can move on to the next step. Okay. It's very important that once you accept it and you say, this is really, really bad and I'm really disappointed about it, and I need to work through that so that I can get to a place where I can really learn from what transpired here. Okay. So that's the first step is you failed. We know we failed or we've experienced a significant setback. Let me start by accepting that reality so that I can then really genuinely learn from it. The second step is this idea of analyzing the forest and the trees and what went wrong. So, in medicine, doctors often do what's called a post-mortem. After the fact, when someone dies, they look at the reasons for their death, right? And in part, that's sort of what I'm advocating people do here, is analyze the forest and the trees. The forest is the big picture. So think back to those 7 types of failure that I mentioned. Um, which one does your failure fit into? And how bad is it, right? So if you conclude that this is a slip through your fingers failure and the magnitude is a 2, right? Which means that with some creative thought you can get back to the table, then you've got a setback. Okay. But then what I really want you to do is move from the forest, the big picture, to the trees, the specifics. So what happened? At what point did the negotiation break down or take a turn for the worse that ultimately led to either a setback or an outright failure? And I'm sure in most of your negotiations, because I can do this, is you can pinpoint where did things go wrong? It was this conversation, it was this discussion that really sent us down the wrong road, right? And the whole idea is to think about that because if you can get back to the table, you can then turn and say, okay, well, if I re-engage, how am I going to do this differently? Where do I pick up the conversation? Things along those lines. So I often talk about moves and turns. This is a concept that was originally developed by Debbie Kolb, negotiation theorist. And talking about sort of the intimate details of a back and forth. But there's also what we would call critical moments. There's a moment in a negotiation where things fall apart. And it's easy to point to and it's easy to look at and say, when this negotiator left the situation and somebody came in to take their place, that was the end. There was no relationship. And as a result, that caused the collapse, right? So, but the important thing is that you really have to analyze what's going on and not just think you're going to understand the failure without doing that. You really have to look initially at the big picture and then move to sort of the granular details of looking at the specifics of what's transpired in the negotiation and how to really figure out why did this happen? Okay. The third step is where I think this gets hard for people. So, what I'm asking people to do is not just learn any lesson from what transpired, but I want you to make sure that you're learning the right lesson. And when I say this, people often think I don't really know what you're talking about. So let me try to be clear here. So John Maxwell, as you can see on your screen there, said experience is not the best teacher. Evaluated experience is. And what he's getting at there is if we're really going to learn from an experience, we have to really evaluate what happened. And what I've seen, and this is doesn't, I think people who are studying negotiation, spending a lot of time working on this, they don't fall into this trap. But people who negotiate as part of their job, and things along those lines do fall into this trap, which is that they often have one core approach to negotiation that they've learned over the years, whether by experience or somebody in their atmosphere taught them how to negotiate, and they apply it to every negotiation that they have, right? And so when we do that, one of the things that we don't do is we don't look at the similarities and differences between negotiations. So if I'm going to learn something from a previous negotiation that might help me in the future, I have to make sure that that transferability is really legitimate. And what I mean by that is, are the dynamics the same in negotiation? When I was doing the research for the book, I came across a quote by a woman named Catherine Bartol, who teaches at the University of Maryland. And the quote was, when you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation. Now, what she was getting at is the unique nature of negotiations. And I appreciate that. And I disagree a little bit. I think negotiations are unique in many ways, but there are things that can be transferred from one to the other if we look carefully enough, right? And so we want to make sure that we're looking at core dynamics of a negotiation. For example, is this a one-time negotiation where I succeeded? And am I trying to apply that approach to a negotiation, maybe that's more long-term? If so, that's not the right way to do this, right? One-off negotiations, one-time negotiations, we have different objectives when the relationship doesn't matter. Things like that, okay? Or, in one negotiation, was there a power asymmetry? And in this negotiation that you're dealing with, is there, a power balance that's different, right? There are a number of dynamics that we know exist in negotiation. And what I'm really saying is make sure that when you transfer your lessons from one negotiation to another, that it really fits. I remember doing a training for a company, and a woman came up to me and said, look, I had a really successful negotiation in the past, and I think there's some applicability to a negotiation that I'm preparing for that's coming up. And she said, would you talk this through with me? And I said, yes. So we started to talk about it. It was at lunchtime during one of the trainings. And when she started to explain what she had done in the past and what she was going to be negotiating in the future, there were so many differences between the processes that I began to point them out. And by the end of the conversation, she said, okay, so what I'm actually really taking from this conversation is what I did earlier is actually not helping me and might actually lead me astray in this other negotiation because there's too many differences. And I said, exactly. And she had not thought about it in that way. She had thought, I did this, it worked, so I'm going to just transfer those lessons and do the same thing. And that conversation saved her a lot of heartache, right? Now, the one thing I just want to also mention when it comes to this is that when we talk about lessons, um, there's behavior, tactics, approaches, and strategy in negotiation, right? But there's also a mindset. So, in psychodynamic theory, and I'm not going to get too into that for you, there's a concept called transference where we've learned through an experience or through something, a deeply held belief, right? And that belief sits in our subconscious. It's out of view. It's not the kind of thing we think about, but we draw on it without thinking about it. And that's actually what happens and why we don't learn the right lessons, right? If I learn that an approach to negotiation that is very zero sum, and I apply that to every negotiation because I think that's how you negotiate. Um, and in this negotiation, the relationship is really critical and I want to develop it over time. That's going to get in the way and it's not going to help us learn the right lesson. In fact, it's going to do the opposite, which is that we're going to apply an approach that's not going to serve our purposes in this negotiation. So the distinction I'm making here is make sure to learn the right lesson, not any lesson that you can just think of from the past. Okay. That's step three. Step four, that's two more. And then, like I said, I'd really love to open it up for questions and comments and etc. Step four is probably the hardest part of this process because I'm asking people to actively learn what your weaknesses taught you. So we all have weaknesses in negotiation, just like we have strengths. And often when we think about um, setbacks and failures, we can trace those back to a weakness that we have. Maybe we don't manage our emotions very effectively, and that causes us to, struggle and lose sight of our objectives, things like that. And what I'm asking people to do is I want you to step back and say, what are those things in negotiation that are important beliefs that I have, right? And are those still helping me? Am I if I hold these beliefs, are those productive for me when it comes to negotiation? Or might there be a better or different way to negotiate? And could I actually unlearn certain things about negotiation and replace them with things that might be more helpful? And I'm going to give you one that's controversial, but I believe it very deeply. And it has to do with compromise. So most people, when they think about negotiation, they view compromise as synonymous with negotiation. Okay, so in the book, I have a chart that it looks very similar to what you have on your screen there, right? What might my weaknesses be? So I'm going to say that viewing compromise as synonymous with negotiation is a weakness. Then I want you to say, well, for the moment, I'm going to accept that that's true. Okay. Why do I hold that belief? Well, I was taught that you've got to give something up of great importance in negotiation to reach agreement. Okay. Now, if that's true, and let's imagine you say, okay, well, if I unlearn that, what do I replace it with? Right. And what I would say there is that compromise is a core aspect of all negotiations. I don't always have to give up something that's important to meet my objectives. So the point here is what I need to unlearn is that I always have to compromise in negotiation in order to get somewhere. There are negotiations, and if I think back to the book I mentioned before, the book of real world negotiations, if you were to read that, one of the things that you notice is there's very little compromise. People engage in creative problem solving. They engage in getting to the underlying interests, which when we figure that out, often we find that we don't have to compromise. And so this notion of maybe viewing compromise as synonymous with negotiation is actually a problem. And it's actually getting in my way of learning and coming up with better negotiation solutions. Maybe I should try to replace compromise with creative problem solving and see what happens, right? That's what I'm asking you to do in this instance, that there are certain things, and I see this a lot. Where people have learned certain ways of negotiating and they've never questioned them. And they don't understand how, for example, seeking a compromise solution, there's nothing wrong with that per se. But when you do find a compromise solution, you need to understand that a compromise solution leaves everybody basically unhappy. And that is not how negotiation always needs to be. Again, that book and in other places, I've seen endless examples of where if you get to these underlying interests, you can actually come up with a solution that doesn't require you to give up more than you to give up something of critical importance. Often when I talk to people about why they don't like to negotiate, they will say, because I have to give up something really important to me in order to get where I want to go. And I'm like, well, if that's your view of negotiation, then no wonder you don't want to do it. Who would want to give up something of great importance to themselves just to move forward? Now, that's not to say that compromise doesn't have a role. What I've experienced is that when people, in general, when time is of the essence, um, then compromise may be the best way forward. But you have to recognize that those kinds of solutions are going to be less than optimal. You're always going to feel like this was not a great solution, but it kept the process moving. If that's your perspective and your goal is get this done as quickly as possible, then maybe compromise makes sense. But understand the downside, which is that you're going to come up with a not a great agreement that maybe is just okay and you could live with it. And that's not what we always want in negotiation as best we can, right? Okay, so then the last step, and I really do want to stop because I want to make sure to have time to talk about all this. The last step is the idea of returning to the table smarter and stronger. So that's a pretty vague and general notion. But let me explain it this way. There are two ways to return to the table. So if we have a setback in negotiation and we're ready to get back to the table, how do we think about this? How do we prepare to do that, right? And so my advice is the following. The first thing is you're going to need to knock on the door first. So a lot of times when a negotiation you experience a significant setback, people are often, again, remember, they're in blame or rationalization mode, right? So they think to themselves, the other side needs to reach out to me. They're the one who caused the collapse of the process, so they need to get in touch. And I can tell you that you can spend the rest of your life waiting for the other side to knock on the door. The analogy that I share in the book is, and the story I share in the book is Nelson Mandela, right? Nelson Mandela spends 27 years in prison, comes out and reaches out to F.W. de Klerk and says, we need to sort this out. And when a journalist asked him, why did you reach out to de Klerk? He said, someone's got to knock on the door first. And I spent enough time in prison thinking about all this. I don't have time to waste. And so if Mandela can do it, so can you, right? So put your ego aside. And a lot of this is putting our ego aside and knock on the door and say, hey, I still think there's a way that we might be able to come up with a way forward, a solution here. Okay. Then start with them. What is it that they need to get out of this, and how do you know? Okay. Um, you always need to be clear about what your objectives are, but it's quite likely that you also need to make sure that you understand what their objective is at this point, and did things change from the last time, you all engaged. And then finally, it's really important to think about what went wrong and then how do you do things differently, right? If we go into a negotiation where we experienced a setback and we're thinking we can potentially get somewhere, and we do the same thing again, right? As we did the first time around, you're going to fail again. So the question is, how can I do things differently this time? For example, if I used logos or logic to persuade the other side and it didn't work, can I use a different approach to persuasion? Can I use pathos or storytelling and emotions to help sort of re-engage and to make my points? Okay. If you've actually failed and you can't see a way back to the table, how do you grow over the long term as a negotiator from this experience? So the first thing that I would say is if that's the case, um, one thing to do is to go to the balcony, which I think many of you may be familiar with that concept of stepping back and stepping away to really learn, and talk to your colleagues and say, here's a scenario, what do you think really happened here? That outside perspective can be incredibly valuable to help you to look at and learn from what happened. take your unlearning seriously, right? In step four, I talk about, those notions of what do I need to unlearn? And, Peter Drucker, the management guru, said, if you want to learn something new, you have to unlearn something old. And that's what I'm asking you to do there, right? And to really take it seriously and struggle with the idea of maybe compromise isn't the best way to do this, or maybe if I see the other negotiator as a partner, not my best friend by any stretch of the imagination, but also not an enemy, can I, think about this problem and this challenge differently? So taking your unlearning seriously. And then there are some key places in negotiation where people typically struggle. There's a couple that I talk about in the book. One is on the emotional side of things that people don't manage emotions well, but there are others like uncertainty. Many of us don't do well with uncertainty. There's an old saying, tell me yes, tell me no, but tell me something, right? And that's all about, I don't want to sit with an uncertain situation. I want a way forward in some way, shape, or form. But there are ways of sitting with uncertainty, and it can be incredibly helpful to do that. So concepts like uncertainty, learning to be adaptable, are really critical in terms of your learning here. And let me just finish with this notion. So as I was, doing the work on the book, I came across the notion of the Japanese art of kintsugi. And many of you may be familiar with this, but basically kintsugi is the art of imperfection, right? That when a vase like you see on your screen breaks, when you put it back together, you do so with precious metals um, to remember the imperfections of life and the imperfections of all of us as human beings, and in particular when it comes to negotiation. So for me, I found that when I teach, train, and work with parties, when I share my own struggles, when I share my own failures and wear those on my sleeve, if you will, um, people really resonate with that. And what you're doing is you're saying, this happens. It's not perfect. Yes, I work in this world. I've been working in this world for 30 years and I still fail. And I think that that opens the door for a lot of people to embrace failure. And the last thing I'm gonna end with this. One of my colleagues, when I was doing a podcast interview with him, he said, after this conversation, one of the things that I'm realizing is you're decoupling shame from failure. Failure happens. Shame is something that we add to a failure as a meaning, right? That this is what it says about me. And I think if that's right, that if this somehow helps people to realize, okay, failure is going to happen, and I don't have to be ashamed of it, but I do have to learn from it, then, that's what's critical. And I know that's easier said than done. And I know in many places it's hard to do that, from a cultural point of view and other kinds of notions. But for me, the more that I share my own failures with people, the more they really want to learn about negotiation and they want to become better negotiators. So let me stop there and open it up to questions, comments, etc.
Dr. Weiss, thank you so much. Very, very fascinating and interesting. I learned quite a bit and saw I was looking at the questions, quite a bit of them
Sure.
pushing in all sorts of different directions. So I will invite those who are listening and attending to look at the questions you like the most or put yours in. As I said before, I will be starting with the most voted question as of now, but hopefully you can upvote or add yours soon. So the question that I got here, a little bit on the longer side, there might be like 2 or 3 questions in between. So we might chop that up. So in high
Sure.
stakes negotiation, how do you distinguish between temporary setback and a signal that the entire strategy is flawed? Let's start with that,
Yeah.
and then we see the other two.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good question. I think that, look, especially if you look at, for example, peace processes, right? Um, Failure, if I can put it that way, or setbacks is the norm. You might have 10, 15, 20 processes that occur and ultimately lead to some success at some point, right? So I think the question is to ask yourself, can I see a way back to the table? And does it still meet my interest? Again, I think the important thing is that we don't want to just negotiate to negotiate. We want to negotiate because we are clear in our mind that this is the best course of action, right? To me, negotiation is one process for trying to achieve your objectives. You may look at a situation and say, if these are the circumstances under which I'm negotiating, like this is not going to meet my objectives. And so I don't want to get back to the table. It's not in my interest to do so. So I think that's the key question is um, we've had this breakdown. Okay, let's call it that, right? Can I see a way back to the table that's clear and that it still makes sense to do so? Or um, is it better for me to step away? Maybe the like timing of this negotiation isn't right for me. And if I give it some time, the dynamics change. Um, so it's that analysis that I think is so important of saying, what happened here? How bad was it? And if I can't see a clear avenue back to the table, maybe I need to step back for a little bit and think about it. It's an important decision, but I think the for me, the point is to do that kind of an analysis and say, as I'm looking at this, and I know my objective is this, can I achieve that objective? And if I can't, then you're really experiencing a failure and need to step away for the time being.
Thanks.
Hmm.
So just the same box has a couple of questions. So
Yep.
it was up voted. So I don't know which ones people
Sure.
are voting for. So I'm going to read them as well. So the
Yep.
second one there is, how do you recover credibility with counterparties, stakeholders, boards, investors after a visible negotiation failure?
So I think one way, to do that is to sort of own that that's what happened and that's what transpired. So you don't have to take all the responsibility for the failure. Okay. Like failures and negotiation are because negotiations are an interdependent process, you each own your part in what transpired. When I've had the most success, I've come back to that person and said, look, um, this didn't end in the way that I imagined it might and that I hoped. And I'm guessing you have the same perspective. Um, I know where there were things that I could have done differently, and I'd like to try to get back to the table here and figure out whether we can find a solution. Are you up for that? So part of it is for me is owning your role. And again, it doesn't mean that you're the only one that's created this problem and this challenge, but you're not simply turning and saying, well, if you hadn't done all of these things, we wouldn't be here, right? You're starting with yourself and you're saying, let me just own this, that I could have done things differently. I'm thinking, you could have as well. But it's that, I'm a big believer in modeling the behavior that you're looking for. And so when you do that, imagine like, what's the other person going to say, right? It's very hard for them to say, well, you know, you're still a jerk and I'm not going to engage, right? You've disarmed them with that kind of an approach. And I think it can be exceedingly helpful.
And as I'm rereading the question, what if these people are the ones you're representing? They're behind you and you failed the negotiation on their behalf. So they're not counterparties, but actually people that you're
Mm.
representing.
Yeah.
Would you
And
do the
that,
same? Would you do slightly different? Yeah.
no, I think I would do something similar. I think that one of the important dimensions here, though, when you've got that kind of scenario, is there's a lot of suspicion that happens. And so you need to find ways of um, sharing information so that they begin to see that you're not hiding things or cloaking things. I think that's the worry and the fear is that when you represent others, it's easy to say, well, they told me I can't say that, or they told me this or that, right? Obviously, there's an internal negotiation that you need to have before you sit down at the table. But I think some of that is a transparency. I mean, again, it depends on the nature of the negotiation. If it's a one-off kind of more zero-sum approach, then that gets harder because people are just not sharing information. If it's one where you can imagine that problem solving and getting down to underlying interests would really help, then, steer the conversation. And the other thing is one of the things that I will do is I'll say, look, I'm going to share something that's important to the folks that I'm working for. And the purpose of me doing that is that I'm hoping that you're going to do the same thing, that we engage in reciprocity. And I'll be very clear with people that, hey, look, I'm going to tell you this, and you know, my hope is that you're going to share something as well that I'm not aware of, right? And that we can get into this reciprocal behavior. If you don't, then I understand the game you're playing and it's different and we're going to have to take a different approach. But I think if you sort of float a trial balloon and say, look, let me put this out there, um, because people often say to me, well, you don't want to share everything. I said, I didn't say share everything. I said, share one thing that matters to you and see what the response is. And if it's positive, then you create that reciprocal back and forth. And if it's not, then maybe you start getting into a conversation about BATNAs and say, look, if you're not willing to do that, let's talk about what this is going to look like, right? Because I may have to walk away, and what does that mean for you, right? And then you get
Super.
into that sort of reality testing kind of questions that has an impact, right? That can perhaps help people to sort of say, well, okay, I didn't really think about it that way. Maybe I need to.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for the advice. I'm going to move on to the next person to distribute a bit more. So
Sure.
we're seeing an increasing shift to zero-sum games in politics. How can we better promote win-win outcomes? I know that's not directly like getting back to the table, but maybe in a
No,
in
go
a
ahead.
bigger societal level is bringing back to a win-win table. Yeah?
Yeah. And you're exactly right. There's no question about that. That we're seeing a transactional approach to negotiation take over from a more of a mutual gains way of doing things. Um, how do you change? Look, I think for the better part of a few decades, we've ha embraced this notion of trying to find these kinds of solutions that are going to benefit everybody in negotiation. I think the problem with transactional negotiations and the zero-sum way of thinking is that we know somebody always ends up losing. And when that happens, you know, all you're doing is setting up the next round of negotiation for me to take advantage of you or me to try to win this one, right? And so unfortunately, I think the answer to your question is that people have to learn from the results of those negotiations. I think one of the big topics, obviously, in the global negotiation landscape is tariffs, right? And I think one of the ancillary sort of offshoots of this is that you're seeing that countries are beginning to look around and say, well, if this is going to be the deal with regard to tariffs, whether it's the United States or somewhere else, right? Can I go elsewhere? Can I exercise my BATNA and start to build relationships with other countries that don't have and are not willing to put those kinds of tariffs on me? So I think that the consequences, to answer your question, the consequences are going to speak loudest. Um, that, people are going to realize that this transactional way of approaching things has a significant consequence. And when they feel it, they're going to realize that they have to move away. That's going to be very frank and very honest, that's going to be a very painful process because we are going to engage in um, these negotiations because I think a lot of people don't believe they have alternatives. So they'll agree, and then they'll have to sit with that painful lesson until the next time around. And, somebody once said to me, and I think they're right, and they were talking about history, but I think in some way, I think it applies to negotiation as well, that there's a pendulum swing, right? That for many years in the 40s and 50s, zero-sum negotiation was the way that we did this, right? And then in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we saw swing toward more of a mutual gains and a recognition there's an interdependence to most of our negotiations, right? And things like that. And so we saw swing to this mutual gains kind of thing. And now we're seeing something swinging back in the other direction. Um, I believe, generally speaking, that the lessons that we learn from zero-sum negotiations are painful, but they will ultimately be the thing that sort of pushes us back in the other direction. It will take time and it will take some hurtful solutions to help us to learn that lesson.
Yeah.
And that's probably not the answer someone's looking for, but I think it's the
Wow.
reality that we're sitting
If
with,
if
right?
if I know our audience and INSEAD alumni, business people, driven, productive, how can I shorten that time? How can I pendle that faster to the other side? Is
Yeah.
probably the anxiety of many of us. But I think you gave us at least one path to think about. So let's move on to another question. In a world where ghosting, simply not responding anymore, closing the loop regardless of decision, what kind of failure would you consider that, the ghosting exercise? And what are your thoughts on that?
So, I would put the ghosting in the anxiety. If you remember back to the three bowls of porridge early on, that's one response, which is that I think when people ghost, they're either, afraid, experiencing a lot of anxiety, things along those lines. You know, just as an aside, one of the things that I'll say here is that I do a lot of mediating. Some is international, but a lot is, within organizations and companies and things like that. And more often than not, when people push a process aside or they don't, when I meet with them one-on-one and say, what's going on here, they're driven by fear. They're afraid. And most of the time we don't think that. We think that they're just a bad person or whatever it is. We don't think, what are they afraid of? And my experience is that most of the time people are afraid. And so if someone ghosts you, um, either they're experiencing a lot of anxiety, they don't know how to get back to the table in a productive way, or um, again, they may hold the perception that it's up to you. They may say, you're the one who caused this. And I hate to say that, but you know, most people haven't done this kind of an analysis, right? So they're going to engage in the blame game. And so they're going to be thinking it's up to the other side to come back around to me. And you may have to say, look, it doesn't say anything to me. In my mind, it doesn't say anything about you. In fact, it says that you have a strength of your conviction if you take that step and knock on the door. And don't assume, I I say this in my trainings and my teaching as much as I can. Assumptions are the silent killers of effective negotiation. And what happens is that we are assuming all kinds of things when this process, when we experience a breakdown or a failure, right? The assumptions machine starts to churn and we create entire stories in our head about what happened. And we don't even have a clue whether that's true or not. But it's comfortable for us to protect our ego and things like that. So, check the assumptions that you're making about why somebody might be ghosting you. You don't know, maybe they've had a family crisis. Who knows, right? There's a whole bunch of things that actually just happened to me recently where it wasn't a typical negotiation, but somebody disappeared and then came back around and said they got into a car accident and they've been recovering and I couldn't understand what happened. And now I get it, right? So
Yeah.
so I think that would be my advice there.
This actually I resonate a lot with that story. A few years back, I was also negotiating a contract, and the other person completely disappeared. And after actually a month or so, I found out that person had a serious mental health problem, burnout, left the job, and everything else. So she
Yeah.
basically just packed and left. And of course,
Yeah.
we were the least of her concerns at that time. So indeed, she ghosted us, but she
Right.
had bigger fish to fry. Super. I
Yeah.
think there's one more here that I would put it in is among the most voted. So I would like to give time to that as well. And so, do you have any golden rule or key tip for how to stay in control of your emotion when the other side surprises you with an absurd accusation or clearly incorrect data?
So look, yeah. So, you know, I think the bottom line with negotiation, and as one of my students said to me once, if we could just take emotions out, this would be so much easier. And I said, of course it would be, but that's not how human beings work, right? So the first thing, and the other thing that I try to emphasize to people is when we learn about negotiation, people are like, oh, let's talk about what you're going to do with this person or that. The focus is external. If you want to be a really good negotiator, turn the mirror on yourself. My colleague William Ury, who I'm sure many of you know, who wrote Getting to Yes, the sort of famous negotiation book, he wrote a really good book, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, called Getting to Yes with Yourself. And he said, often the hardest negotiator that we have to deal with is the one that's staring us back in the mirror. And so what you have control over in negotiation is your reaction and your response. So first of all, if you don't manage the emotional side of negotiation well, invest in learning emotional intelligence because it will help you to understand yourself and others. But in the interim, we talk about this notion of going to the balcony, and I think it's a really helpful tool of when you feel like you're not sure what to say or do, or you're going to say something out of frustration and anger, stop. Step away from the table and don't say it. Give yourself the ability to pause. There's a great quote by a guy named Ambrose Bierce who said, "When angry, you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret." And the balcony is this simple technique of stepping away, of giving yourself time to process, especially when you're dealing with something very challenging and very difficult. And it doesn't take very long for you to recenter yourself, 15, 20 seconds, take deep breaths, things like that. But that's what you have control over. And the other side can do all kinds of things, um, and they don't matter because your reaction and your response is ultimately what you have the ability to manage. So that's where you need to work and say, what are my triggers? What are the things that set me off? And how am I going to manage those things? And how am I going to pay attention to my body? Your body tells you things in negotiation, like when your heart is racing, right, or beating out of your chest. That's a time to step away. It's not a time to respond, even though it might feel great.
Wonderful. Dr. Weiss, I wish we could continue the conversation. I'm really enjoying learning so much, getting some things validated. So you already see the reactions of people here. So I would like to invite everyone to do a big reaction and put your hearts and applauses and thumbs up here to show Dr. Weiss how much we enjoyed it today. Thank you very much, everyone. Before you go, let's go through that little round where we actually share with you a few links and QR codes. So get your phone ready or print screen, whatever is helpful to you. I'm going to start putting up here a link for his book so you can find it, and for his website if you would like to know more about his work. So we have it here. So I'll give a second there for you to take a photo or link into it. So getting back to the table, I'm sure you also got excited about his other book, The Real Stories. I myself even already checked it out and bought it on Kindle. So I think I would highly recommend that. Then let me move on to the next one. Just thanking our previous speakers. If you haven't seen those yet, feel free to go to our website to check them out. And today we had Dr. Joshua Weiss. Thank you once again. Next time we're going to have Adam Cahen next month. And then in November, we're going to be having Dr. Huda Abadi, and those will be the last two speakers of the year. We're already preparing the lineup for next year. So if you have any names or ideas of book authors that you would like to see us present, please send some information for us to reach out, and we'll be able to then try to create a lineup that you will be more excited even about. With that in mind, here is our NCW links again. Once again, we are looking for people who are interested in helping promote and proofread materials that we're distributing for free for educators all over the world in 130 languages. And here are some other resources. One of the things that Dr. Weiss today mentioned was Trump tariffs negotiation. That's on the upper right screen. That's an article that just came out last week that I wrote with a few colleagues and friends. So feel free to reach out to that as well. Looking forward to that. That's a short read. My part is only 8 pages. And so hopefully that will be interesting for all of you. And then my new book with a couple of colleagues, which was the previous webinar. You can have here the QR codes and a code here at the bottom, Sprout, that gives you a 20% discount. With that, then let me just go back to the first page, because today our speaker is Dr. Joshua Weiss, and I would like to give you the opportunity to reach out to that. With that, once again, Dr. Weiss, thank you so very much. It was a real pleasure, and I look forward to our catch-up call after that to discuss how we can collaborate even more with the NCMC and your institute. Thank you so very much.
That would be lovely, and thank you all for the attention and your lovely claps and hearts. It's greatly appreciated. So thank you so much, and best of luck, everybody. And by the way,
Thanks
one other
for your
quick,
work.
if you do read the book, I would love your feedback and thoughts about what made sense, what didn't. Like, don't hold back. Really, that's the whole idea, is to create a conversation around this.
As a negotiation nerd, I might take up beyond that. So
Okay.
wonderful.
Take care,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone. See you next
Bye-bye.
time. Bye.